Have you ever wondered what dark secrets lie behind the splendor of Europe's greatest dynasties? Let's journey back in time to France, where one family held absolute power for 261 years, shaping the history and culture of an entire nation. In this video, we'll unravel the dramatic rise and fall of the House of Valois. Reigning from 1328 to 1589, the House of Valois was not just a cadet branch of the prestigious Capetian dynasty. They were rulers who amassed a colossal fortune, estimated at the equivalent of $1 billion today. Under the leadership of pivotal figures like Charles VII, Louis XI, and the cunning Queen Catherine de Medici, they centralized the monarchy, forged a powerful French state, and championed the glorious Renaissance arts, exemplified by the magnificent Château de Fontainebleau. But power and wealth always come with a dark side. Behind this velvet curtain of opulence lay a world of brutal assassination plots, hidden affairs that could alter the course of history, and bloody religious conspiracies. In today's video, we will pull back the veil on the shocking centuries-old secrets of the House of Valois, a story more dramatic than any fiction. Imagine a knife in the dark. A king, believing he's meeting a loyal messenger, lets a Dominican friar approach. The friar leans in, as if to whisper a secret, and in one swift, shocking motion, plunges a dagger deep into the king's abdomen. The year is 1589. The king is Henry III, and with his dying breath, the reign of one of Europe's most formidable, brilliant, and bloody dynasties comes to an end. They were a family that dragged a fractured medieval kingdom into the modern age, a family that fought the longest war in European history, and a family that drenched their own country in the glories of the Renaissance and the blood of its people. Their story isn't just about crowns and castles. It's a saga of ambition, betrayal, genius, and secrets so dark they make modern scandals look like child's play. We're talking about a fortune that in today's money would comfortably sail past the billion-dollar mark. But this isn't just a story about money. It's a story about power, how you get it, how you keep it, and the terrible price you pay for it. Forget everything you think you know about dusty old royal families. The Valois were different. They were masters of art and masters of assassination. They built palaces that still take our breath away, and they orchestrated massacres that still haunt our history. Their legacy is a paradox, a centralized, culturally magnificent France built on a foundation of conspiracy, religious warfare, and hidden affairs. So buckle up. We're about to pull back the velvet curtain on the House of Valois, and I promise you, what we find is more gripping, more scandalous, and more relevant than you could ever imagine. Let's rewind the clock to the very beginning, to 1328, the Capetian Dynasty, a line of kings that had ruled France for over 3 centuries, suddenly hits a dead end. King Charles IV is dead, and he has no direct male heir. A power vacuum opens up, and in the world of medieval politics, a power vacuum is just another word for an invitation to war. This is where our story begins. Enter Philip, Count of Valois. He's a cousin of the late king, part of what's known as a cadet branch. Think of it this way. If the main Capetian line is the CEO's son, Philip is the CEO's ambitious nephew. He has the family name, the Capetian blood runs in his veins, but his claim is not a slam dunk. It's a calculated risk, a power grab. To understand Philip's rise, we need to understand an ancient legal custom that shaped the French monarchy, Salic law. This law, selectively invoked, stipulated that the crown could not pass through a female line. It was a legal tool designed to keep the French throne French. And right on cue from across the English Channel, King Edward III of England pipes up. He argues, hang on a second, my mother Isabella was the daughter of the French King Philip IV. By that logic, I have a better claim to the throne than this Valois cousin. Isabella, known as the she-wolf of France, was a formidable figure, and Edward used her bloodline as his pretext for a challenge. And just like that, with those two competing claims, the fuse is lit for what would become the 100 Years' War. Now, this is a really important point to understand the Valois mindset. When Philip VI takes the throne, he isn't old money. He doesn't have the unquestioned, divinely ordained legitimacy that his predecessors enjoyed for centuries. He is, for all intents and purposes, new money. His ascension is a high-stakes venture, not an inheritance. It's messy, it's contested, and it's immediately challenged by a powerful rival. You could almost compare his situation to a modern-day frontier entrepreneur, someone like the pioneers of Brickell Avenue in Miami, who saw a swamp and envisioned a financial district. Philip saw a moment of dynastic weakness and envisioned a new royal house, his house. He rolled the dice and in doing so plunged France into a century of conflict. His legitimacy was born in dispute, and that stigma, that shadow of the usurper, would follow his family for generations. The war began almost immediately, and it was a catastrophe for Philip VI. The French army, built on heavily armored knights, was slaughtered by English longbowmen at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. The English longbow could fire arrows with terrifying speed and power, piercing French plate armor from a distance. It was a systemic shock to French arms. Disaster followed disaster. The Black Death swept across Europe, killing nearly half the French population and paralyzing its economy and society. Then, in 1356 at the Battle of Poitiers, Philip VI's son, King John II, was captured and hauled off to London, an unimaginable humiliation for a nation. The kingdom was left in the hands of a young regent, the future Charles V, to face peasant revolts, the Jacquerie, and political chaos. The beginning of the Valois dynasty was anything but glorious. It was a desperate fight for survival. So how does a family go from being the new money upstarts to the established old money dynasty that defines a nation? They do it through a brutal, brilliant, multi-generational strategy of consolidation culture and cunning. First, let's talk about consolidation. As we've seen, the 100 Years' War was, for a long time, an absolute catastrophe for the Valois. The English, with their devastating longbows, were winning battle after battle. They captured Valois kings, controlled vast swathes of French territory, and at one point, it looked like the whole Valois experiment was about to fail. The Valois king, at the time Charles VII, was so weak, he was mockingly called the King of Bourges, because that small city was one of the few places he could safely rule. France was on its knees. So how did it get this bad? How did one of Europe's great powers become so broken that its own heir was a king of nothing? To understand that, we have to look at the generation before, at Charles VII's father, King Charles VI, a man whose personal tragedy plunged the entire nation into chaos. The story begins on a hot summer day in 1392, when Charles VI, leading his army, suffered a terrifying psychotic break, suddenly drawing his sword and attacking his own men. It was the first sign of a severe mental illness that would plague him for the rest of his life. For the next 30 years, the King of France would swing between moments of clarity and horrifying episodes of madness. He would forget his own name, fail to recognize his wife and children, and famously suffer from a glass delusion, believing his body was made of glass and would shatter if touched. A mad king was a fatal weakness, so the royal court began a desperate, decades-long cover-up. They ruled in his name, issuing edicts and laws as if nothing was wrong, creating a puppet government to hide the power vacuum. One of the most tragic and bizarre incidents of this period was the Bal des Ardents, Ball of the Burning Men, in 1393. To entertain the melancholic king, a masquerade ball was held. 6 young noblemen, including the king himself, disguised themselves as wild men by wearing tight-fitting linen costumes covered in pitch and flax to resemble fur. The king's brother, Louis of Orleans, arrived late and drunk, approaching with torchbearers to see who the masqueraders were. Sparks ignited the flammable costumes. In an instant, the men became human torches. 4 died in agony. The king was saved only because a quick-thinking duchess threw the train of her gown over him to smother the flames. This horrific event became a symbol of the madness and peril of a court without a sane leader, but a secret that big can't be kept forever. Instead of unifying the kingdom, the king's condition became a prize to be fought over. The powerful dukes of France, particularly the rival factions of Burgundy and Orleans, engaged in a brutal civil war to see who could control the mad king and his royal authority. This chaos was a dinner bell for the English. Seeing France tear itself apart, King Henry V invaded, crushed the divided French nobility at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, and marched through a paralyzed kingdom. This all led to the single most humiliating moment in French history, the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. In a document signed in the name of the helpless Charles VI, the French leadership officially disinherited the king's own son, the Dauphin Charles, the very man who would become our King of Bourges, and named King Henry V of England and his heirs as the rightful successors to the throne of France. So when Charles VI finally died, his son wasn't just a weak king. He was, legally and officially, not the king at all. He was a disinherited fugitive in his own country, with almost no hope of reclaiming his birthright. And then a miracle happens, or at least that's how the story's told. A peasant girl named Joan of Arc appears, claiming to hear voices from God telling her to drive the English out and see Charles VII crowned properly at Reims Cathedral. It sounds like a fairy tale, but it worked. She galvanized the French army and the French people, turning the tide of the war. Her victories gave Charles VII the legitimacy and the momentum he desperately needed. After Joan's capture and tragic execution, Charles didn't falter. He used that momentum to finish the job. He created France's first professional standing army, the Compagnie d'Ordonnance, reformed the tax system, the taille, to pay for it, and systematically pushed the English out of the country. He was also aided by brilliant administrators like the financier Jacques Coeur, who helped rebuild the kingdom's shattered economy. What Charles VII, now known as Charles le Victorieux, Charles the Victorious, achieved was monumental. It was the ultimate consolidation of power. He inherited a broken, divided kingdom on the verge of extinction and transformed it into a centralized state with a secure monarch. This effort was on a scale that rivaled the ambitions of the Habsburgs, who were simultaneously trying to manage their vast, sprawling Holy Roman Empire. Charles VII took the shaky new money claim of his ancestor Philip VI and forged it into the solid gold of a true, undisputed monarchy. He proved the Valois were not just temporary placeholders, they were here to stay. If Charles VII was the rebuilder, his son, Louis XI, was the ultimate consolidator. History often skips over Louis to get to the glittering renaissance of Francis I, but to do so is to miss a pivotal figure, one of France's most fascinating and effective kings. Nicknamed the Universal Spider, l'Universelle Aragne, by his enemies for his preference for spinning complex webs of intrigue rather than waging open war, Louis XI was the embodiment of the shift from a medieval knight king to a modern pragmatic statesman. Louis was a man of contradictions. He was intensely pious, dressing in old worn-out clothes and wearing a battered hat pinned with lead medallions of the saints. Yet he was utterly ruthless, never hesitating to use torture, assassination, and imprisonment to achieve his ends. He distrusted the great nobles, whom he saw as a constant threat to royal power. Instead, he relied on spies, diplomats, and a vast intelligence network to outmaneuver his rivals. Louis's greatest foe was Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Burgundy was not just a duchy, it was a de facto state, stretching from the Netherlands to the Swiss border, and it was wealthier and more sophisticated than France itself. Charles the Bold was the epitome of the medieval knight, proud, ambitious, and dreaming of turning his duchy into an independent kingdom. The showdown between Louis and Charles was a classic struggle between cunning and force, between the emerging centralized state and the dying feudal order. Louis won not on the battlefield, but in the corridors of power. He funded Charles's enemies, stirred up revolts in Charles's territories, and patiently waited for his rival to make a mistake. That mistake came. Charles the Bold embroiled himself in a series of costly wars with the Swiss, and in 1477 he was defeated and killed at the Battle of Nancy. His death shattered the Burgundian dream. Louis moved immediately, absorbing the Duchy of Burgundy and Picardy into the royal domain. With one stroke, he had eliminated his most dangerous feudal rival and massively consolidated France's eastern border. He had finished the work his father started, crushing the power of the great lords and ensuring that the only real power in France belonged to the king. He left his successor a kingdom that was unified, secure, and ready to step onto the European stage. But military power is only half the story. To become true old money, you need more than just soldiers and tax collectors. You need prestige, you need culture, you need to become the heart and soul of the nation itself. This is where the next generation of Valois kings, particularly Francis I, truly excelled. If Charles VII was the consolidator and Louis XV the schemer, Francis I was the ultimate showman. He was a contemporary of Henry VIII of England and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and he was determined not to be outshone. The rivalry between these three young, ambitious monarchs defined European politics for the first half of the 16th century. They famously met at the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, an extravagant display of wealth and power designed to impress, but which ultimately achieved no lasting alliance. Francis I saw the incredible artistic explosion happening in Italy, the Renaissance, and he essentially decided, I want that for France. This wasn't just about pretty pictures, it was a deliberate strategy. By becoming a great patron of the arts, he could project an image of France, and by extension the House of Valois, as a sophisticated, powerful, and modern force in Europe. And he didn't just buy art, he imported the entire Renaissance ecosystem. He famously persuaded an aging Leonardo da Vinci to move to France, giving him a chateau and the title first painter, engineer, and architect to the king. Can you imagine that? Having the genius behind the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper on your personal payroll. But it didn't stop there. Francis began a massive building project that transformed the royal estates. The most famous of these is the Château de Fontainebleau. Before Francis, Fontainebleau was a medieval hunting lodge. He turned it into a sprawling, breathtaking masterpiece of Renaissance architecture and design. He hired Italian artists like Rosso Fiorentino and Primaticcio, who, along with French artists, created what became known as the School of Fontainebleau. This was a unique style, a fusion of Italian mannerism and French tradition that would define French art for a century. The palace was filled with frescoes, sculptures, and tapestries, a dazzling display of wealth and taste. The Gallery of Francis Sinourser, for example, is a masterpiece, with intricately carved wood paneling and complex frescoes celebrating the king and his dynasty. The Château de Fontainebleau became the Valois family's answer to what Versailles would later be for the Bourbons. It was a statement piece, a cultural capital designed to awe visitors and cement the Valois dynasty's image as the arbiters of style. This patronage is incredibly similar to what we've seen with great American industrialist families, like the Whitneys. The Whitney family didn't just accumulate wealth. They used it to build institutions like the Whitney Museum of American Art, shaping the cultural landscape of their country for generations. That's precisely what the Valois were doing at Fontainebleau. They were creating a national treasure, linking their family name forever with the golden age of French art, but building a legacy through art and architecture. That brilliant strategy of soft power was only one half of the equation. It was the beautiful, serene mask they presented to the world. And if there's one thing you must understand about the 16th century, it's that you never, ever trust the mask. Behind that exquisite facade of Fontainebleau, the Valois court was a place of breathtaking danger. It was a snake pit. Imagine a pit filled with the most beautiful jewel-toned serpents in existence, their scales shimmering in the torchlight. They are mesmerizing to look at, but they are all venomous, and they are all coiled to strike. This was the reality of the Valois court, a world of whispering campaigns, of shadowy political intrigue, of violent religious fanaticism, and of the most brutal, unforgiving power politics imaginable. While the Valois kings were paying Leonardo da Vinci and commissioning portraits to project an image of serene, God-given authority, they were simultaneously engaged in a desperate, bare-knuckle brawl just to hold on to the throne. And no single event in their long and storied history rips the mask off more violently or more completely than the saint, Bartholomew's Day Massacre. This wasn't a battle, it was a bloodbath, a state-sanctioned explosion of butchery in the streets of Paris, an event so horrific it would permanently stain the reputation of the dynasty. And the architect of this horror, the mind that conceived of it, and the will that pushed it into being, was not a king, but the Queen Mother, the Valois matriarch herself, Catherine de Medici. To understand the massacre, you have to understand Catherine. She is one of the most complex, formidable, and debated figures in all of European history. She was not born to the French throne. She was an outsider, an Italian, the daughter of the legendary Medici family of Florence. Think about what that means. The Medicis were not ancient royalty. They were bankers. They were the ultimate new money who, through sheer intelligence, ambition, and utter ruthlessness, had clawed their way to the top, buying and bullying their way into controlling a city-state and funding a cultural explosion we now call the Renaissance. Catherine was born of this DNA. Politics for her wasn't about chivalry and noble ideals. It was a transaction, a cold calculation of risk and reward. It was business. She was brought to France as a young girl, a political pawn, married off to Francis I's second son, Henry. She was the Italian shopkeeper's daughter, looked down upon by the snobbish French aristocracy. And for the first 10 years of her marriage, she failed in her one essential duty. She produced no children. She lived in constant fear of being repudiated, sent back to Florence in disgrace. But then something changed. She began having children, 10 of them in total, securing her position. And then fate, or perhaps misfortune, intervened again. Henry's older brother, the heir to the throne, died unexpectedly after a game of tennis. Suddenly, Catherine, the scorned Italian, was the wife of the Dauphin, the future king of France. She was queen consort for 12 years, but the real power lay with her husband, King Henry II, and his powerful mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Catherine remained in the shadows, watching, learning, waiting. And then came the day in 1559 that changed everything. During a tournament held to celebrate a peace treaty, her husband, King Henry II, a strong and vigorous man, decided to joust one last time. His opponent's lance shattered against his helmet. A long wooden splinter pierced through the king's visor, driving deep into his eye and brain. He lingered in agony for 10 days while the best surgeons in Europe tried frantically to save him, even recreating the injury on the heads of condemned prisoners to practice the extraction. It was no use. The king died. In that moment, Catherine de Medici stepped out of the shadows. She took as her personal emblem a broken lance with the motto, "From this, my tears and my pain." She would wear black, the color of mourning, for the rest of her life, creating the image of the eternally grieving widow. But this was no wilting flower. This was the beginning of her reign. Her eldest son, Francis II, was a sickly teenager. He died after just 1 year. Her second son, Charles IX, ascended the throne as a 10-year-old boy. Her third son, Henry III, would follow him. For the next 30 years, her sons would wear the crown, but Catherine de Medici would wield the power. She was the regent, the queen mother, the unwavering center of the French state. She was a woman in a world of savage men. She was an Italian in a court that despised foreigners. She had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than all of them just to survive. And she thrived. She governed with a mastery of manipulation and a profound understanding of human weakness. Her enemies, and she had many, whispered endlessly about her methods. They whispered about poison. How convenient, they said, that her rivals seemed to sicken and die so suddenly. They whispered about her perfumers, skilled Italian artisans who could craft the most beautiful scents, but who, it was rumored, could just as easily craft a colorless, odorless toxin to be delivered in a glove or a letter. And most famously, they whispered about her flying squadron, her escadron volant. This was her elite cadre of beautiful, intelligent, high-born ladies-in-waiting. On the surface, they were the ornaments of her court. In reality, they were her secret service. They were deployed to charm and seduce the powerful, arrogant men of the court, dukes, cardinals, generals, and in moments of intimacy, in the quiet of the boudoir, they would extract secrets, gauge loyalties, and uncover plots. Catherine weaponized charm, turning the court's own vanity and licentiousness against itself. She was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. This is the woman at the center of our story. Not a simple villain, but a brilliant, desperate survivor. A political grandmaster holding a kingdom together with sheer force of will. And in the summer of 1572, her board was about to be overturned. The stage is set in Paris in August. The city is dangerously overcrowded, simmering with tension under a hot summer sun. Catherine has orchestrated what she believes to be her ultimate masterstroke of peace, a political marriage designed to heal the deep bleeding wounds of the wars of religion. She is marrying her own Catholic daughter, Margaret of Valois, to the young, charismatic leader of the French Protestants, the Huguenots, Henry of Navarre. The idea was that this union would bind the two warring factions together. For this wedding, the entire Huguenot nobility, thousands of them, have ridden into the fiercely Catholic city of Paris. It's supposed to be a celebration, but it feels more like two armed camps staring at each other over a banquet table. The air is thick with decades of hatred and suspicion. Catherine's plan soon develops a fatal complication. It comes in the form of a man named Gaspard de Coligny, Admiral of France. Coligny is the most respected and influential leader of the Huguenots. He's a seasoned warrior and a powerful statesman, and he has managed to do what Catherine feared most. He has captivated her son, the impressionable young King Charles IX. The king, now a young man, is starting to look up to Coligny as a father figure, listening to his advice over his own mother's. And Coligny is advising something that to Catherine is pure insanity. He wants France to go to war with the mighty Catholic Empire of Spain, to intervene on behalf of Protestants in the Netherlands. For Catherine, whose entire foreign policy was based on a delicate balancing act, this was a nightmare. A war with Spain would bankrupt France and invite invasion. Coligny had to be stopped. His influence over the king had to be severed. So Catherine did what she so often did. She opted for a quiet surgical solution, an assassination, a shot from a window as Coligny was walking home, but the plan failed. The assassin fired, but the shot only tore off one of Coligny's fingers and shattered his elbow. He survived, and now Catherine's problem is 1,000 times worse. The failed attempt has not eliminated her rival. It has turned him into a martyr. The entire Huguenot nobility, who are all in Paris for the wedding, are now enraged. They swarm Coligny's bedside, brandishing their swords, swearing that if the king will not give them justice, they will take it themselves. They openly accuse the rival Catholic faction, the House of Valois, but many suspect the Queen Mother's hand. The city is on a knife's edge. The Huguenots are angry, armed, and plotting revenge. Catherine's neat surgical strike has failed, and now she's facing the prospect of a bloodbath, a potential Huguenot uprising right in the heart of her capital. This is the moment of Catherine's chilling calculation. She is trapped. Her plan has backfired spectacularly. She feels the walls closing in. And so in a secret, frantic, late-night meeting at the Tuileries Palace, she goes to her son, the king. We can only imagine the scene. Catherine, the master manipulator, playing on every one of King Charles's insecurities. She paints a terrifying picture for him. She tells him that the Huguenots are not just angry, they are plotting a coup. They will kill him. They will kill his brother. They will kill her. Their only hope for survival, she insists, is to strike first, not just against Coligny, but against all of them. A single, decisive, preemptive strike, a targeted execution of the entire Huguenot leadership, a swift decapitation of the Protestant cause while all its leaders are conveniently gathered in one place. The young king is hesitant, tormented, but Catherine, perhaps aided by his brother and other hardline Catholic counselors, presses him relentlessly. Finally, in a fit of panicked rage, Charles IX supposedly breaks, screaming the infamous words, kill them all, so that no one is left to reproach me." Catherine had her authorization. What began as a plan for a limited political purge was now greenlit for something far more terrible. On the night of August 24th, 1572, the eve of the feast of St. Bartholomew, the trap was sprung. The prearranged signal was given. The bell of the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, right next to the Louvre Palace, began to toll slowly, ominously in the dead of night. It was answered by other church bells across the city. This was not a call to prayer. It was a call to slaughter. Admiral de Coligny, still recovering from his wounds, was among the first to die. A group of assassins led by the young Henry, Duke of Guise, whose father had been assassinated by a Huguenot years before and was now burning for personal revenge, burst into his house. They murdered Coligny in his bedchamber, and to prove the deed was done, threw his body out of the window into the courtyard below, where the Duke of Guise was waiting. This act of political murder was the spark that lit the inferno. The plan to simply execute the leadership immediately and catastrophically spiraled out of control. The Parisian mob, already whipped into a fanatical anti-Protestant frenzy by decades of sermons and propaganda, joined in. The gates of the city were sealed. What followed was a citywide orgy of violence. Catholic citizens, encouraged by the city militia and extremist preachers, went on a rampage. They hunted down anyone suspected of being a Huguenot. Neighbors murdered neighbors. Debtors murdered their creditors. People were dragged from their beds and butchered in the streets. The Seine River, it was said, ran red with blood, and the bodies piling up against the bridge pylons were so numerous they blocked the flow of the water. The slaughter went on for 3 days in Paris and then spread like a virus to a dozen other cities across France. When it was finally over, an estimated 5,000 people lay dead in Paris, and perhaps as many as 30,000 across the entire country. Henry of Navarre, the Protestant groom at the center of this bloody wedding, only saved his own life by feigning a conversion to Catholicism at sword point. As the news spread, Catholic Europe rejoiced, but Catherine knew she had unleashed a monster. She immediately began the cover-up. She hid her own central role, framing the entire event as a spontaneous and unfortunate, but ultimately necessary act of self-defense. She claimed the king had been forced to act to crush a Protestant plot against the crown. She hid her calculated political decision-making behind the convenient, chaotic fog of mob violence. This brutal, horrifying event reveals the other darker side of the Valois dynasty's genius for survival. They understood in their bones that a crown wasn't just secured with soft power, it was secured with cold, hard, terrifying power. This ruthless pragmatism was a core part of their political DNA, a trait that had been sharpened and perfected through generations of strategic maneuvering, especially through their use of marriage alliances with families like the Medici, the Habsburgs, and the Guises. Each marriage was a strategic move, a thread in a complex tapestry of power designed to elevate their status and secure their borders. Their power was also built on cold, hard cash from their control of commerce. By controlling the major French ports on both the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, they sat at the toll booth of a burgeoning global trade network, giving them the financial muscle to fund their armies, their palaces, and their political ambitions. So there you have it, the complete dual-sided picture of Valois power. On one hand, the enlightened patrons of the arts, shaping the cultural landscape for generations. On the other, the ruthless pragmatists, willing to drown their own capital in blood to eliminate a political rival. By orchestrating the massacre, they believed they had neutralized the great Protestant threat. They had shown the world their willingness to use absolute terrifying force to maintain their crown. On the surface, it seems their power is absolute, their kingdom finally secure after decades of religious war. But here's the twist. Beneath all that gold leaf and Renaissance splendor, the Valois family was hiding a dark and rotten core. The threats didn't just come from the Protestants. They came from within their own extended Catholic family, specifically the hyper-ambitious House of Guise from Lorraine. The Guises positioned themselves as the champions of ultra-Catholicism, arguing that the Valois kings were too weak and too willing to compromise with the Protestant heretics. They were charismatic, powerful, and immensely popular with the people of Paris. The Guises were, in effect, running a parallel government, a deep state within France. Their conspiracies were constant. They plotted to control the king, to sideline the Valois, and perhaps even to seize the throne for themselves. This rivalry was a cancer within the state, a constant power struggle that weakened the crown and fueled the flames of civil war. In 1588, the ultimate prize was on the line, and King Henry III, the last Valois king, was cornered. His cousin, the handsome and popular Henry, Duke of Guise, had effectively chased him out of his own capital city on the day of the barricades. The king's authority was in tatters. Realizing he could never win a political battle against his immensely popular rival, Henry III decided to end the rivalry by other means. He orchestrated a deadly trap. Luring the Duke of Guise to a council meeting at the Château de Blois, the king had his personal bodyguards ambush his cousin in the royal antechamber. The duke was stabbed to death at the foot of the king's bed in a meticulously planned assassination. His brother, a cardinal, was killed the next day. Henry III framed the murder as a necessary defensive act against a traitor, but the backlash was immediate and catastrophic. The assassination didn't save the crown, it destroyed it. The Catholic League, enraged by the murder of their champion, declared open war on the king. Less than a year later, in August 1589, Henry III was himself assassinated by a Catholic fanatic, a friar named Jacques Clément, while preparing to besiege Paris. His death marked the end of the Valois male line, a dynasty that had ruled for over 260 years. This final violent act was the moment the Valois dynasty effectively bankrupted its political capital, leading directly to its own extinction. With the family itself gone, all that remained were the immense wealth, the lands, and the cultural legacy they had amassed over centuries. While the Valois male line was extinguished in a flash of violence, one remarkable figure from that family lived on. She was a living, breathing testament to the dynasty's brilliance, its scandals, its art, and its incredible cunning instinct for survival. This is the story of the king's sister, the last Valois, Margaret of Valois, known to history as the legendary Queen Margot. Years before his death, her own brother, King Henry III, had made a ruthless political calculation. He looked at his brilliant, politically savvy sister and saw not family but an uncontrollable variable in the brutal chess game for France. Margaret was a living conflict of interest, a Catholic princess married to the leader of the Protestants, Henry of Navarre. She had connections and sympathies on both sides of the religious divide, which made her dangerously unpredictable. Fearing she could broker her own alliances or become a rallying point for his enemies, the king did what cornered rulers often do. He chose to neutralize the threat, even though it shared his blood. In 1586, he had Margaret imprisoned in the remote and forbidding Usen Castle, a fortress perched on an ancient volcanic plug, intending to erase her from the political world. But Margaret was the ultimate survivor. She was the daughter of Catherine de Medici, and she refused to simply fade away. She didn't just endure her confinement, she conquered it. With incredible resilience, she transformed her prison into a miniature version of the Valois court, creating a vibrant hub of culture with poets, musicians, and intellectuals. And it was here, in the heart of her gilded cage, that she began her ultimate act of defiance, writing her famous memoirs. While her brother tried to erase her from history, she was writing herself back into it, seizing control of her own story for all posterity. It was a brilliant power move, a declaration that she would not be silenced. And then, in a stunning twist of fate, The world outside her prison walls turned upside down. The great rival of her family, the Duke of Guise, was assassinated. Her jailer, King Henry III, was assassinated. The Valois male line was extinct. And who was the new King of France? Her estranged husband, Henry of Navarre. Suddenly, Margaret the prisoner's status was completely inverted. She was no longer a disgraced princess. She was the dowager queen, sister of the last king, and the ex-wife. Their marriage was later annulled, of the new one. When she finally negotiated her freedom and returned to Paris, she wasn't a pathetic relic. She was a living legend. In a city weary of war, she was nostalgia personified, the last glittering link to the golden age of the Valois. She established the most brilliant cultural salon in the city, becoming a powerhouse patron of the arts. She was La Reine Margot, celebrated, respected, and finally free. Her story is the final brilliant chapter of the Valois saga. She is the human link between the dynasty's political fall and its enduring, tangible legacy. She wasn't just the keeper of the Valois memory. She was the living embodiment of its wealth, its culture, and its taste. And it's her story that provides the perfect bridge to understanding what that legacy truly consisted of. So let's take a step back and look at the asset portfolio of this incredible family. What did their billion-dollar fortune actually consist of? First and foremost, there was the land, the royal estates. These weren't just properties. They were symbols of power and centers of government. We've talked about the magnificent Château de Fontainebleau, their Renaissance pleasure palace. But there was also the Louvre in the heart of Paris. At the time, it wasn't the public museum we know today. It was a grim, fortified royal residence, a statement of Valois power at the center of their capital. These estates were the physical embodiment of their rule. Second, as we mentioned, was their massive income from trade. By controlling the Atlantic and Mediterranean ports, they effectively put a meter on the French economy. Taxes on imports and exports, on salt and other goods, created a steady stream of revenue that was the envy of other European monarchs. It was this commercial wealth that allowed them to fund their armies and their extravagant artistic projects. Third, and perhaps most valuable, were their cultural assets. This is more abstract, but no less important. They owned the School of Fontainebleau. They owned the style, the prestige, the very idea of French Renaissance culture that they had nurtured. This cultural capital paid dividends in the form of international prestige and national pride. When people thought of high culture, they thought of the Valois court. And finally, of course, were the traditional revenues of a monarchy. Royal taxes levied on the people and feudal dues collected from the nobility. This was the bedrock of their finances, the old money that supported their new ventures. Now, what happens to all these assets is perhaps the most interesting part of the Valois legacy and what truly sets them apart from other fallen dynasties. Think about great American families like the Vanderbilts. They built a colossal fortune on railroads and shipping in the 19th century. They built opulent mansions on Fifth Avenue and in Newport, but within a few generations the fortune was largely squandered. The Gilded Age estates were sold off or torn down. The money was diluted and dissipated. The Vanderbilt name went from being a synonym for unimaginable wealth to a cautionary tale about shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The Valois assets did not suffer this fate. When the last Valois king, Henry III, was assassinated, the dynasty died with him. But the assets, the entire state apparatus they had built, did not die. It was all passed on, almost seamlessly, to the next in line for the throne, their distant cousin, the Protestant leader Henry of Navarre, who converted to Catholicism to become King Henry IV, the first of the Bourbon kings. This transition is key. The Bourbons inherited a kingdom that was far stronger and more centralized than the one the Valois had found. They inherited the tax system, the professional army, the royal estates like the Louvre and Fontainebleau. They inherited the cultural prestige. The Valois fortune wasn't squandered, it was transferred. It's much more akin to the way the Mellon family in America used their banking and industrial fortune to create trusts and foundations. The wealth wasn't just for personal enrichment. It was institutionalized, designed to outlive the individuals who created it. The Valois assets became the foundation upon which the Bourbons, like Louis XIV, the Sun King, would build an even more powerful and absolute monarchy. This speaks to a different kind of influence, a different kind of longevity. It's not just about a family name continuing, but about a family's work enduring. You can see a modern parallel in a family like the Grosvenors in the United Kingdom. For over 300 years, the Grosvenor family has owned vast tracts of the most valuable land in London, in areas like Mayfair and Belgravia. Their name might not be on every building, but their influence is baked into the very fabric of the city. Their wealth and power have shown incredible longevity, passed down and managed across centuries. That is the ultimate legacy of the House of Valois. The family itself is gone, a name in the history books, but their influence persists, invisibly woven into the DNA of modern France. They took a fractured medieval puzzle and pieced together a nation. They endowed that nation with a cultural identity so powerful it still defines France today, and they created a centralized state that, despite the horrors of the religious wars, was strong enough to be passed on, a turnkey operation for the next dynasty to inherit. So when we look back at the House of Valois, we see more than just a list of kings. We see a story of incredible, ruthless, and brilliant creation. They were the architects of a kingdom, patrons of immortal art, and authors of unforgivable crimes. They prove that to build something truly great, something that lasts, often requires a volatile and dangerous mix of vision and violence, beauty and blood. Their billion-dollar fortune was impressive, but their true legacy, the nation of France itself, is priceless. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.